There were some interesting developments at the top of the European Individual Championship today. I will get onto that at the end of this game. But I'm not going to feature a game from one of those top tables, but actually I'm looking at something, well, I've picked something from the pack. With white, Athanasios Mastrovasilis, who's a Greek grandmaster, he's in his 40s, and his opponent, international master Savva Vetokhin, he is just 14 years old and he's playing under the FIDE flag. In other words, he's from Russia. I just thought this was a really interesting game and it's not that long, so I'm going to go through it fairly slowly. So d4 and knight f6, knight f3 and d5. So a very regular start, and well, I always like it when I play with black. Personally, I always liked it just to plant that pawn in the middle of the board. When you do that, you don't get blown away. You put a stake in the center. c4, and yeah, I always like to play the Queen's Gambit declined with black for that very same reason. You protect that pawn in the middle and you can recapture. So you're not losing any ground in the center, which gives black incredible security actually. So really early on in the game. Now, white can play, for example, g3 and bishop g2, the Catalan. Or you could play with knight c3 and then either bishop f4 or bishop g5, Queen's Gambit. But Mastrovasilis plays e3, which is more modest, but actually quite sensible. The bishop prepares to come to d3. This bishop might come out to b2. So this is, well, I think you could call it a Zuckertort system if the bishop comes to b2 with the bishop on d3. And it's a very solid, sensible method of development for white. You could say that this is a almost symmetrical position, but white has a little bit of advantage because that pawn is on c4, putting pressure on black's centre. And Vetokhin plays b6. Well, that's very well motivated. You can see in this position, the bishop here can come out very easily to one of these squares. This bishop is the piece in these Queen's Gambit positions that's kind of lagging behind. It doesn't do any good to come to d7, but it's going to look good on the long diagonal. So b6 is very well motivated. Knight c3, and one could simply play bishop b7 here, and this is, yeah, I mean, this is all terribly sensible. But Vetokhin plays bishop d6 straight away, which is certainly where we want this bishop, pointing down through to the king side. And queen c2. So early development of the queen. It's on a very good diagonal. It could be that white wants to play e4 and break in the middle, which will open this up. Could be that white wants to exchange here and play knight b5 to hassle the bishop and the pawn. So, for example, castles, takes, and knight b5. So the bishop can't move away because c7 will be hanging. And this is very reasonable. Vetokhin played bishop b7, so he just carries through on with his idea. And what a great diagonal that is for the bishop. And Mastrovasilis continues with his idea. So pawn takes, you want to keep that solid pawn in the middle, which basically allows black more freedom to maneuver because you have space, you claim the centre. So knight b5. So this was white's plan. Whether it's good or bad, this is white's plan. So basically he wants to take that bishop. So if black castles, then white can claim that bishop. And, well, you could argue that that's a plus. even though these bishops aren't doing very much at the moment. Claiming the two bishops is generally a good thing. So instead of castling, Vetokhin decides to play bishop b4 check. And white interposes. And black takes on d2. So that means if queen takes, then that knight will just be driven away. So for example here, and white has just wasted time. So therefore knight takes. You don't want to play king takes. So knight takes. So that means this pawn is attacked. So black solves that problem by playing c6 and the knight comes to c3. So I think white's motivation is, even though this has lost a bit of time, well, he's exchanged off this bishop, which was on a very good diagonal. And this is a little bit closed. You can see that bishop doesn't look so great on b7. Black castles. Perfect. I mean, again, this is one of the reasons why I, with black, always liked playing the Queen's Gambit, because I didn't need to think about king safety. I knew I was going to play e6, bishop e7 or somewhere out, and castles just like that. And then the middle game begins. But the middle game begins with a safe king, and that always appealed to me. Now, white needs to get the king to safety, so therefore bishop e2. And black decides, okay, want to do something about this bishop, so c5. And it starts to attack white's centre as well. So if white were to castle here, then black can simply exchange. And, well, a symmetrical pawn position, there's even a bit of pressure here. I mean, black is absolutely fine. So that's why white plays knight f3 in order, after c takes d4, to recapture with the knight. And you can see that's a nice blockader on d4. Blockading that pawn, which means that that bishop is trapped in. So black doesn't want that. So Vetokhin played knight c6. Sound development. I like this. Notice no wasted moves from black. I really like this. And once again, there's pressure here. White doesn't want to end up, after castles, black will be able to take, and that's fine. So what does white do? Well, white decides to just protect that pawn again. He could take here, but that's potentially dangerous for white. That pawn could later advance, and then this bishop would just rake across the board. So that's why white decided to maintain the blockade. And if white can castle and then later on perhaps exchange here, you might be able to get some pressure. But anyway, black decided to avoid any of that by pushing on with c4. So that's quite a committal move, because it takes the pressure off here. But it does set up a potential pawn storm. You can see there are 3 pawns here and only 2 there. And if these pawns can advance, that's quite nice for black. Absolutely typical of these kind of Queen's Gambit positions. Now, it's possible for white to break those pawns straight away with b3. And you could argue that that has improved white's structure because, there's one nice pawn island here, just one isolated pawn, and this is isolated. But it's actually very hard for white to generate any play here, particularly after a move like knight a5, followed by rook c8 and knight c4, and that knight reaches a beautiful outpost. But white played instead knight e5, so, well, that's a nice outpost for the knight. And if this is taken, then, that opens this up, and that looks pretty nice for white, actually. That's a nice pawn duo. As long as you can get castled successfully, then white is pretty well set up. You can notice there's a lot of pressure here. Therefore, black played instead rook e8, so that's very well motivated. And if white were to exchange off, well, white has just lost time. that really has improved black's position. The rook looking good here. I don't quite see where white's play is coming from, but for black, a6, b5 looks pretty nice. Okay, so white played f4. Now this is absolutely typical of queen's pawn openings, that there's this pawn trio that supports that knight on e5. And once again, if black ever exchanges here, then that could be very pleasant for white because it opens up the rook. I mean, black has, I think, a couple of plans here. The obvious one is to play a6 and go b5 and to expand on the queen side again. I think that's quite reasonable. But I think this is a really interesting moment, actually. And Vetokhin comes up with a very different plan. Knight b4, attacking the queen. And then he simply gave up a pawn by playing knight d3 check. Now, I think this is a very interesting moment in the game. It's clear that white has to capture that knight, either with the knight or the bishop, and then, well, then what? And then take the pawn. So the question is, how would you take that pawn if you had white? I think this is a very interesting moment in the game, and I'm not sure white gets it right. I think it's probably best to play knight takes. And if bishop takes, then knight g4. That's nice for black. But queen takes instead. Now, you could argue that black has a bit of compensation here because the e-file has opened up. And you might be able to play, for example, a5. Here's a nice idea. Exchange off those bishops. And then bring the rook back to press on that e3 pawn. And black certainly has a bit of compensation. But, well, this is an extra pawn, basically. Well, one of these is an extra pawn. There's some compensation. I think that's the way white should do it. But he played bishop takes, which also looks pretty good. I think, you know, this is the danger in this kind of position, that it's just hard to judge what's the best way. And I suppose with that knight on e5, it's very understandable that white took the pawn this way, because the knight blocks the e-file. But Vetokhin now, I think, plays excellently. First of all, a5, and that allows the bishop to come to a6. So this is a really nice idea. You know, this bishop at the moment certainly looks pretty poor, just blocked by the pawn on d5. But after a5, it's found a nice window. And here's an interesting moment. White plays a4 here. King f2 is possible. Obviously, white would like to castle, but bishop a6 is potentially nasty. There's a skewer there. Knight b5, but then the knight can come into e4, and then the knight will be booted away. I mean, it's obvious that black has compensation there. So king f2 is possible. And then I really like this next move, rook e7, with the idea knight e8 d6, and then f6 to drive the knight away. So black certainly has compensation here. Once that knight is driven away from e5, then it sort of opens up the e-file. Right, back here. So a5 played. Now a4. I think this move is basically just superfluous, because after bishop a6, white doesn't intend playing knight b5 anyway. As before, I think knight b5 offers black excellent compensation here, with a knight here and f6 coming. White played queen f5. And now queen d6 was played. This is very interesting. So this queen is potentially looking here. King f2. So the king obviously can't castle. So it steps out. g6. Now the queen should have come back to h3, but I mean, I think it is a little bit offside. So I think it's obvious that black has some compensation here. But queen g5 played, and now an excellent move. Rook c8. So this puts some pressure here. And this is actually suddenly really scary for white, because there's a threat to play rook takes knight and knight e4 check with a lovely knight fork. Even if the king ducks back to g1, well, for a start, that's pretty unpleasant because the rook is blocked in. Black can sack the exchange anyway. Let's push the queen away. Let's push the knight away. And then take here. Okay, let's push the knight back. Knight takes. Okay, a lot of forcing moves there, but basically black has managed to get rid of that knight from e5. This knight has gone on tour and managed to grab a pawn. Black definitely has good compensation for the exchange there. You know, you can imagine these pawns dashing down the board and that knight returning to c3. So I really like rook c8. Very nice idea to take here. In fact, it was also possible in that position. And that actually would have been maybe even more dangerous. Similar ideas. Anyway, this was pretty good in the game. So rook c8 just played. Knight g4. So this is already quite difficult for white. Knight g4 played. An exchange. I mean, that actually really helps black because the e-file is now open. Queen b4, and this is really nasty. Threatening to take here. If rook d2, then this exchange sack is really pleasant. Attacking the rook, attacking the pawn here. So white would have to give back that one. And yeah, black is doing well. Maybe rook c8 to here might be quite tasty. Otherwise, you might be able just to snaffle a pawn. Okay, back here. So queen b4 just played. Knight takes d5, which first glance looks pretty scary, but actually black has calculated this very well. Check. The king is going on a little adventure, and now Vetokhin had obviously calculated that bishop b7 is a winning move. And Mastrovasilis is just lost here. So there's a skewer. If the knight moves, then careful, queen takes g2. If rook b1, that doesn't make any difference. The queen just nudges to a2, attacks this one, and again the knight has to move. So Mastrovasilis played knight f6. The king stepped up. And a rook was taken, but it actually doesn't help white at all because there are two threats here. Queen takes g2 and rook takes e3. In fact, white is lost. He ran with the king. Rook takes e3. It's not getting better, folks. Rook g1, protecting this one. And now f5. And here white resigned. Why did white resign? Okay, well, the queen has to move. It can't move back. Whoops, I'm going arrow crazy because of the rook. And if it moves forward, then there's this devastating check. Let's finish here. g3. Queen takes h2 mate. I just thought that was a really interesting game. So Savva Vetokhin, just 14 years old, looks like one to watch out for. He's already an international master, and he's now on 5.5 points after 9 rounds. Yeah, I think we've played 9 rounds. Let me just check that. Yeah, we've played 9 rounds. 5.5 out of 9. It's very impressive. But I really like this game. Look how that bishop has transformed into a glorious piece. And this was really the big theme of this game. So watch b6 and bishop b7. So he's trying to make this bishop work. And then later, when the bishop got blocked because there was a big blockade here, there was this really tasty idea of knight b4. Bishop is blocked by a5, and it came back to life with bishop a6, and then somehow it got really messy. But I really like this idea of knight d3, sacking a pawn. It wasn't necessary, but it showed real understanding. Reminds me of Korobov's pawn sacrifice against Ponomaryov that we looked at the other day, actually, to get through to this square. But anyway, do check out that video if you want to do a compare and contrast. Anyway, let me just give an update on scores. So the big news was that Anton Korobov was leading, but he was defeated by Alexei Sarana in round 9. So Sarana is leading with 7.5, and then there's a pack of players on 7. 2 rounds to go. It's really tight. So big game tomorrow is Yesipenko against Sarana. I shall be reporting back and let you know what happens there. Hope you enjoyed that. If you want to support the channel, then do check out patreon.com PowerPlayChess. The links, you'll find the links down there. We would appreciate your support. Please help keep the lights on, and click the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.